In the last video, we talked about what brain peptides are and why everyone is suddenly talking about them. But the question I hear most often from patients and families is not whether they work, but rather whether they're safe. And that is absolutely the right question to ask first, because the brain is not something you want to experiment on blindly. In this video, we're going to talk about what we actually know about safety, what the real risks are, and the biggest mistakes people make when experimenting with brain peptides. By the end of this video, you should feel much more confident about how you think about this entire category, because how you think about this category of peptides is much more important than me saying, take this peptide for that condition. You being empowered is the key. The human brain contains about 80 to 90 billion neurons forming trillions of connections. Your memory, your personality, your ability to focus, your emotional resilience. When we talk about brain health, we're talking about the organ that makes you, you. So caution here is super appropriate. So what do we actually know about safety? And this is where nuance matters. Brain peptides are not new at all. Some of the most well-known neuropeptides have been studied since the 1970s and 1980s, and a few have been used clinically in Europe and Asia for multiple decades. But this is also not a fully settled science. Long-term lifetime safety data is certainly limited, so the honest answer sits somewhere in the middle. As always, this video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice or create a doctor-patient relationship. There are 3 levels of evidence in the brain peptide world, or at least that's how I'm going to break it down at this point for this video. Level 1, decades of clinical use. Level 2, human clinical trials. And level 3, early or experimental research. Let's take a look at 3 real examples. And this is not medical advice, merely me showing you how I think through this. But I do not know your situation. And so again, this is not medical advice. The first brain peptide example that I'm going to go over is 𝗙𝗵𝗻𝗄, because it's one of the most studied neuropeptide drugs. It has been studied in randomized clinical trials involving hundreds of Alzheimer's patients and more than 1,000 stroke patients. Actually, now that I think about it, the studies I looked at and are going to show are actually kind of old because I wanted them to be old. There's actually more recent data too, so it's definitely in the thousands of thousands. So in this first study, 𝗙𝗵𝗻𝗄 in Alzheimer's disease, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial with a neurotropic agent, 𝗙𝗵𝗻𝗄. Read the abstract, but the conclusion I'm just going to draw your attention to. 𝗙𝗵𝗻𝗄 treatment was well tolerated and resulted in significant improvement in the global score 2 months after the end of active treatment. Or this next study, efficacy and safety of 𝗙𝗵𝗻𝗄 treatment in early recovery after acute ischemic stroke, a randomized placebo-controlled, double-blinded, multi-center clinical trial. That's like gold standard in science. And the conclusion is that 𝗙𝗵𝗻𝗄 was effective, safe, and well tolerated in the early recovery phase after a stroke, and significantly improved neurological and global function outcomes compared to placebo. So again, it's clearly been used clinically in parts of Europe and Asia for stroke, traumatic brain injury, and dementia for decades. And the summary across the trials is that it is generally been shown to be safe and well tolerated. I still encourage you absolutely to go look up those studies yourself and look into the details. No study should ever just be looked at the title and the conclusion. Don't ever do that. But look deeper into it and read it more. I want you to be educated for yourself. You can see what the side effects were. A lot of them were typically very reasonable, I would say. And in the context of how much it could benefit people, in other words, for me personally, I would have been happy to be one of those subjects in either of those studies, though not that I'd want to have qualified for them to begin with, if that makes sense. So it does not mean that it's risk-free, but it does mean that it is not fringe science. And there is certainly a level of safety to 𝗙𝗵𝗻𝗄 when used wisely and appropriately. Now, the next brain peptide example is Cmax. Cmax is another peptide that has been studied for decades and used clinically for stroke recovery in Russia. So this one, the efficacy of Cmax in the treatment of patients at different stages of ischemic stroke. Kind of funny, treatment is misspelled, but this was Google translated because the actual study is in Russian. Research shows that it increases BDNF, one of the brain's key repair and learning molecules, and influences gene expression related to inflammation and recovery after brain injury. And it actually speeds up functional recovery and improves motor performance. In other words, it helps people recover quicker who have had strokes, and it does so safely. Now, the third brain peptide example here that I'm going to use is 𝗙𝗟𝗏 or 𝗙𝗟𝗏, depending on how you pronounce it. Now, I found this paper on 𝗙𝗟𝗏, a new generation of drugs, synthetic peptides based on natural regulatory peptides. And the summary is that 𝗙𝗟𝗏 was developed from a natural immune peptide and has been used clinically for anxiety without the sedating effects seen with many traditional anti-anxiety medications. But I wanted to throw this one up here because what I found most interesting about this paper is that it listed 220 scientific citations, as you can see here. I just threw up a screenshot here of the last few just to kind of prove a point that there's a lot of scientific literature to support at least this particular peptide's use, potentially, again, when used wisely and in appropriate situations. So in summary, these peptides exist on a spectrum. Some have decades of clinical use in human trials. Others that I have not mentioned here are absolutely experimental. And there's a lot of other brain peptides that are somewhere in that spectrum, from tons of clinical use to complete research. So what are the real risks? And this is the part that I think most brain peptide videos skip. Risk number one, poor sourcing. The peptide supply chain is still largely unregulated, at least in the US. Purity and labeling can vary dramatically, and this is one of the absolute biggest risks. So sourcing well. Risk number two, wrong use cases. Using performance tools for all-out disease states or using disease tools for performance states. That's a mismatch, and context matters enormously, especially for your own brain. Risk number three, this is around unrealistic expectations. Peptides are not magic bullets. They do not replace sleep, nutrition, movement, or metabolic health. See that way too often. Risk number four, lack of medical screening. Undiagnosed sleep apnea, thyroid disease, depression, metabolic dysfunction. Those are all far more common drivers of brain fog, for example, than people realize. Insert anxiety, insert cognitive impairment. Risk number five, stacking too aggressively. The internet and social media love brain stacks. The brain does not necessarily love those stacks, though. Your brain does not necessarily love those stacks, especially if being stacked on top of or instead of appropriate medications or those needed healthy lifestyle modifications that are being omitted. The biggest risks are usually not the peptides themselves, it's how people are using them. These are not for everyone. And groups that should approach with extreme caution include pregnancy or breastfeeding, active cancer, uncontrolled psychiatric illnesses, anyone avoiding those foundational lifestyle modifications or changes that are needed. And I will add in anyone chasing productivity shortcuts without real guidance. And again, I love LLMs, large language models like ChatGPT, but they usually miss the exact context of who you really are and what you really need. They'll think almost any idea of yours is a really great idea. And unless you clarify the hell out of what your exact situation is like, and you ask that LLM appropriately and guide them, prompt them appropriately with an amount of precision that frankly most of you realistically don't have, it's not going to give you good advice. So if someone is looking for a shortcut instead of building a real foundation, peptides are not the right place to start. The biggest mistakes people make: buying from random internet vendors, starting multiple peptides at once, expecting overnight transformation, ignoring sleep and metabolic health, copying Reddit stacks. Like, your brain is not a Reddit experiment. So, if safety depends on the person and the situation, who might actually benefit the most? In the next video, we're going to talk about the brain states where peptides are being explored the most, from ADHD or concentration issues, anxiety, depression, brain fog and burnout, or mild cognitive impairment, or even dementia. That's where this conversation starts to become even more helpful. So if you care about protecting your brain or helping someone you love, subscribe so you don't miss part 3. I'm Dr. Yoshi Ram. Hope you found this helpful.